This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. It's tax season, and we're all a bit tired of numbers. But here's one you need to hear. $16.5 billion. That's how much the IRS flagged for possible identity fraud last year. Now here's a good number. 100 million. That's how many data points LifeLock monitors every second. If your identity is stolen, they'll fix it. Guaranteed. Save up to 40% your first year at LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
Hello, this is Simon Brew. I'm the editor of Film Stories magazine, and a very warm welcome to the Film Stories podcast.
Come with me.
And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
And movies that had stories.
That the story just sucks them in.
This is just the beginning.
Stories. We would be honored if you would join us.
Hello, and a very warm welcome to Film Stories with Simon Brew. I am Simon Brew, as always. That's absolutely everything you need to know about me. The aim of the podcast, however, we're here to talk of the stories of films, as the title pretty much gives away. So what I tend to talk about, production stories, development stories, behind the scenes stories, things about really the journey that a film takes from its conception through to its release, and sometimes afterwards as well. The films that I tend to choose for this podcast have a bit of a mainstream leaning, really, and also they're films I have some degree of investment or interest in. I don't do snark, plenty of other places you can get that. I'm just really fascinated by just the sheer industry, the effort, and almost the fluke, really, in getting a story idea to the big screen for us all to see and enjoy. The two films I'm kicking off 2020 with in the podcast, though, they're two films I really, really like a lot. And I'm going to start by taking us back to 1994 to, what I think is one of Harrison Ford's best ever films. I'll play you a clip. I'll pick up the story the other side of this.
Yeah.
Bob, Jack Ryan here.
Good morning, Jack.
Morning. Listen, I was just thinking, maybe we got off to a bad start here. We're going to be working together here. Maybe we should spend some time, get to know each other a little better. You play tennis? Tennis. You play tennis?
Yeah, I play tennis.
Well, how about we get together sometime? Next week, maybe. Hour before we start work or something.
Jack.
Yeah.
Computer theft is a serious crime.
Well, in that clip from 1994's Clear and Present Danger, you've got the oily villainy of Henry Czerny, who also turned up around the same time in the first Mission Impossible film. That was a year or two later. Also, you've got just a little snippet there of James Horner's glorious score for the film. Anyway, Clear and Present Danger, written by Donald E. Stewart, Stephen Zalian and John Milius, based on the novel by Tom Clancy, directed by Philip Noyce. Cast for this one: Harrison Ford starring as Jack Ryan, with Willem Dafoe as Clark, Anne Archer in there, Joaquin de Almeida, Henry Czerny, as I mentioned, the late brilliant Donald Moffat. You get Benjamin Bratt in this one, in the supporting cast as well, and Thora Birch as well, along with James Earl Jones returning from Patriot Games in the role of Admiral Greer. And this was the sequel to Patriot Games, even though Clear and Present Danger was originally, as I explored in a previous podcast, the Jack Ryan project that was set to go before that. Once The Hunt for Red October had been a success and Paramount decided to change the lead star, again, I explored that in the previous podcast. The idea was do Clear and Present Danger first and then Patriot Games next, but for an assortment of reasons, things swapped round. So director Philip Noyce then, he went from Patriot Games, which was a big success, if perhaps not as big as had been expected at the time, to a notoriously troubled production. He went from battling with Tom Clancy on Patriot Games to the whole story and a half of Sliver, which I may come back to in a future podcast. Sliver starred Sharon Stone and produced by the late Robert Evans, and a very, very notorious film for lots of reasons. But he was one of Paramount Pictures' go-to directors, and he took a call just while he was working on Sliver from John Goldwyn, who was then Paramount's head of production. And what Paramount had was Donald Stewart's first draft of, well, the latest draft of a script for Clear and Present Danger. Now, Tom Clancy's novel Clear and Present Danger was one of the biggest sellers of the 1980s, and Clancy had been difficult. The late Tom Clancy had been difficult to work with on the original film, on the original Patriot, the film before Patriot Games. So people had their bruises coming off the back of that, and Noyce took a look at this script, and his initial thought on it, and a lot of this is detailed in the excellent book Backroads to Hollywood, Philip Noyce, written by Ingo Petzker. And he took a look at the script, and his thought was the same, that as it was with Patriot Games, that the book at this stage was better than the screenplay that he'd seen. Now, by the time Donald Stewart had taken a go at the script, which was the first one that Noyce seen, John Milius had come in and had done the first draft of it. But Paramount wasn't particularly keen on Milius's first draft, and relations between Milius and Paramount would become strained, which will in turn become notable for the story a little bit down the line. I'll come to that shortly. The novel, though, it's worth noting that this wasn't a novel where the character of Jack Ryan was centric, that at this point it wasn't believed that Jack Ryan was going to be a massive franchise character as we know him today. And so in this 700-800 page book, it takes about a quarter of it before the character of Jack Ryan turns up, and that wasn't going to work for a Patriot Games sequel starring Harrison Ford, then one of the biggest box office drawers on the planet. Still obviously a huge and prominent actor, but this was him at the height of his box office powers. Noyce, even though he had those bruises though, and even though he had question marks about working with Tom Clancy again, he did sign up to Clear and Present Danger. So that Donald Stewart screenplay, Tom Clancy vetoed that one, so there was still work to be done here. And Noyce, once he was done with Sliver, he took a short break and then went straight into pre-production on Clear and Present Danger. So this was the point where he brought in writer Steven Zalian, who'd done uncredited work on Patriot Games, to punch up and put into place what the shooting script for Clear and Present Danger. And Mason Newfield, the producer, Philip Noyce, Harrison Ford, they all went off to Harrison Ford's ranch to work out what they liked and didn't like from the novel and the screenplay drafts that had been done to that point. So we're heading now towards the start date for the film, which was November 1993, and the screenplay was in some degree of flux and wasn't finished, and there was still a lot of work to do to be able to hit that, to be able to hit the start date for the film that Paramount had earmarked. A release date of summer 1994 was what Paramount wanted, so they were straight up against a deadline on this one. So they needed really to get moving. The script, after that meeting at Ford's ranch, they identified problems with it, and what Noyce felt was he went back to the original draft that John Milius had written, and he liked, for instance, the action sequences that Milius had written and put into place. But the problem was, Milius had directed a film for Paramount called Flight of the Intruder that hadn't gone very well. It strained relations between the studio, between Milius, and the saving grace here was that John Milius and Philip Noyce still got on, even if Paramount and John Milius didn't get on. So Noyce had a chat with Milius about putting this together and having another look at the script for the film. And eventually he brought Paramount into his thoughts, and an offer went from Paramount to Milius to get back on board the film. They, albeit indirectly, and what Milius said is he didn't want any of the studio's money. Instead, what he wanted was one of the Chevy Suburban vehicles that was going to be used in the film, filled with Cuban cigars. And as it turned out, that's apparently what he received. That during the shooting of the film, they had to make sure one of the Chevy Suburban vehicles remained intact because they needed it to pay one of the writers. They were struggling still with the ending of the film. Steven Zalian as well, there was, as they were trying to identify what the ending of the movie should be, he was writing Schindler's List around this time and was doing script work on Schindler's List, which was filming for Steven Spielberg, so he wasn't really around to help with the ending. And as it turned out, the three credited writers on the movie all worked entirely independently of each other. One area that they did beef up from the book is arguably the central action sequence of the film. And it's a really extraordinary sequence as well, I think, which is the central ambush that takes place in the streets of Bogota in Colombia. Now, again, in the book, Jack Ryan isn't apparently even in this sequence. I can't claim to have read all of the book, but doing research for this, it turns out that wasn't a Ryan sequence at all. And so that was retooled, really, to make that one of the key parts of, certainly the key action moment of the movie. And they looked at first at trying to find a street in Mexico or somewhere where they could shoot that. They couldn't film it in Colombia because during the extensive location scouting for the film, they did. Philip Noyce went just as a civilian to Colombia to explore where they could possibly film. And one of the characters in the movie is a thinly fictionalized, really, version of the infamous Colombian drug lord Pablo Escobar. And so there were all kinds of sensitivities about actually shooting in Colombia, but they did go and explore and then worked out there's no way they could do this with any degree of security and safety for the cast and crew, which is why they ended up recreating Bogota, for instance, in Ecuador and Mexico. And it was in Ecuador and Mexico that they looked at a street that they could use for the ambush sequence. And in the end, they just decided it was a no-go. And that sequence was shot in America. They built their own street. Just so they could have total control over it, so they could choreograph it, so they could place cameras exactly where they wanted to. And so successful was that sequence of the film that in the aforementioned book Back Roads to Hollywood, it notes that scene is used to train was used for a while to train US Foreign Service protection staff, to give an example of how things can go wrong and what to do. Now, Ford and Noyce, we should know, clashed several times over the course of this production. It was quite a frosty relationship, as that would turn out, between the pair, although to the benefit of the film. But one of the things that Harrison Ford really wanted to do was be in as many of the stunts as he could possibly get away with, and Noyce was more veering on the side of caution. And so what you see, I mean, ultimately the star won out primarily on this one. What you see several times during the ambush sequence in the movie is Ford in the car, and there are things flying not far from his windscreen at all. And really there are, by the letter of the law, whatever law there is, sequences there that should be undertaken by a stunt driver, and they're not being undertaken by a stunt driver. They've been undertaken by Harrison Ford himself. So good, though, was that action sequence in the midst of the film that Philip Noyce would subsequently admit that he was disappointed in the film's climax, that the action towards the end of the film he just felt wasn't as big or as elaborate as that ambush sequence that we get in the middle of the film. Now, there were also problems in terms of getting assorted approvals and military cooperation this time round, that notably with 1992's Patriot Games, the screenplay of that was far friendlier to the American military than Clear and Present Danger, because in the case of Clear and Present Danger, what we see is an off-the-books black ops operation going on, and that really wasn't quite the image that the US military was looking to put across. And so the problem here was that really they still needed some military cooperation to get hold of the bits and bobs that they needed for the movie. And so the military pushed back and said they're going to need some script adjustments, and from what I can tell, some of those script adjustments in this case were actually made in order to secure the cooperation they required. That clearances came through only just after filming began in November of 1993, and the production of Clear and Present Danger would actually run from the 8th of November 93 through to the 14th of March 94, and I'm going to come to the problems just in March very, very shortly. There were problems too securing cooperation from overseas military, getting overseas clearance for cooperation from the military as well. But again, these all came through pretty much at the last minute. One thing that they didn't have to worry about was a White House set for the film. I think it's pretty well well known that the White House set that you see in Clear and Present Danger is the same one that was used in the Ivan Reitman comedy Dave, starring Kevin Kline. But also that same set too, it had been built for Dave already by the time Clear and Present Danger came to use it. They'd used it. It had been used in The Pelican Brief, starring Julia Roberts as well. And in the case of Clear and Present Danger, they just paid a small fee and were able to use the set. Now, there were still quite a few disputes to come on this film, even before production wrapped. There was a dispute, for instance, over the ending. That Harrison Ford, for one, didn't like the vagueness of the book ending. In fact, there was a really good Empire on Set report I remember from around the time of the production, where it's simple things like there's a bit near the end of the film where Harrison Ford is going through the coffee factory in the film and sees a switch, and he jams a stick in a wheel, and that was something, for instance, that Ford came up on set. He just felt that Ryan should be doing something rather than just walking through. He has to take some kind of action, so that's why that little bit is in the movie. But also the vagueness of the ending, as originally written, didn't appeal, which is why the film, this is a very mild spoiler, I won't tell the content of it, but just so you're alerted, it's why the film ends with an appearance before Congress, and that appearance before US Congress was not something that found favour with Clancy. He was notably right-wing and didn't particularly have an awful lot of faith in the legislative as it stood. But then the script for this one, unlike Patriot Games, was never as fully nailed down. It was always a little bit looser. But also the film itself was running close to budget and to deadline. And so as that end of filming in March loomed, the start of March, Paramount took action, and it sent a fax to the production team, a fax that was dated on the 1st of March 1994. And in that fax, it noted that there was a fixed end date for the first batch of filming of March the 3rd. It said Harrison Ford has to be gone on March the 8th. First unit had to wrap up fully on March the 9th, and Paramount wouldn't pay for more. It said it gave the date that Philip Noyce was going to return home, because they're on location at this point. And it said that any overruns had to come from the director and the producer fees. And given the cost of the film was around $200,000 a day, that's a sizable amount of money for a producer or director to have to cough up. And the problem was the deadline that Paramount had set was just not going to work. They couldn't hit the deadline. They still had complicated sequences. I think it was in the coffee factory sequences to hit. And it took a lot of toing and froing to finally get the shots that they needed. But there was friction there with, 7-8 months still to go until the release of the film. And more friction was coming once production wrapped. Because one of the things that Philip Noyce tends to like to do, you're contracted in America by the Directors Guild of America, allows you, I think it's 10 weeks to present your first cut to the studio. Noyce was quite quick about getting a first cut together because he wanted to send a copy to his star. And so he'd done this on Patriot Games. He sent his first cut to Harrison Ford, and Ford was not keen on it. Now, one of the things that's also noted is that during the latter stages of production of Clear and Present Danger, The Fugitive got all of its Oscar nominations, and the only person really who didn't get an awful lot of credit in the midst of that was Harrison Ford. So that can hardly have put him in the best of the best of moods. Nonetheless, separate to that, 2 days after receiving Noyce's first edit of the film, he sent what was apparently a 12-page fax to his director with a list of changes and problems. And Noyce and Ford, it was coming out in the press that their relationship was getting quite frosty, and Ford downplayed this and Noyce didn't. I'll come to that in a second. But the director still had a few weeks to deliver his first cut to the studio, and so he opted to do something a little left field. And he did a very early test screening that, even though the film was very much not in a finished state, he decided to jump the gun, get a very early test screening going. And that screening went down incredibly well. The scores that came back from that were very high. And as the story goes, the pressure pretty much lifted at that point, that all of a sudden Paramount dropped any desire to charge its producer and director for overruns, that all of a sudden the studio was fully behind it, fully believed in the project, that the disagreements between Ford and Noyce, detailed partly in that 12-page fax, dissipated to a large degree because an audience had clearly gone for the film. That said, there was still a little bit of a race to the finish line, even though the production afforded Noyce more time to get his edit together than Patriot Games had. It was still pretty tight to get there, and also there were further test screenings and previews that were arranged, but again the scores of these ones came back well. And when the film was ultimately released, the critical reaction to it was more positive than the studio had experienced with Patriot Games. Now, a couple of things about the film. Clear and Present Danger was actually, when it was submitted to the Motion Picture Association of America, with an R rating first up, and it was only on appeal that it got down to the PG-13 that Paramount wanted. This game was very much being played in the 1990s. It's not a modern phenomenon. The thing is, in this case, they didn't have to change a single frame of the film in order to get the PG-13. It was just a simple appeal, and the MPAA agreed. I also want to point out that this has in it, that Clear and Present Danger has in it, the tensest scene I've ever seen in a film involving a computer printer. It's so well done. It's so well constructed. And again, I don't want to spoil it at all, but if you've never had the pleasure of Clear and Present Danger, I really think this is a terrific Hollywood action thriller. There were complaints on the film's release about the complexity of the plot. Again, I kind of quite warm to that, really. But this was, with no two ways about it, a far bigger hit than Patriot Games had been. When it opened in America on August the 5th, 1994, it went straight in at number one with an opening weekend of $20 million. Not The Mask off the top of the box office. Forrest Gump was in third. The two openers against it, actually, were The Little Rascals, which came in at number 4, and Airheads. Remember, I really like Airheads, which was in at number 13. Clear and Present Danger would go on to gross $215 million worldwide. It played a lot better in America than it did overseas. It is a film that's heavily rooted in American politics, but it was still a comfortable hit for Paramount off the back of its $62 million production budget. There were bits and bobs to note with regards to the cast. Anne Archer's role as Kathy Ryan was apparently heavily cut back. She shot a lot more footage that didn't make it into the final cut. I spoke to Willem Dafoe a couple of years ago because his role of John Clark, well, John Clark became a notable character in the Tom Clancy novels, and the role of John Clark is paramount in the book Without Remorse, which for a long time has been gestating as a movie project. And there was talk in the aftermath of Clear and Present Danger that Willem Dafoe would take on John Clark, the role of John Clark, in a subsequent film, which never happened. Since then, Keanu Reeves has been linked with the role, and once again it sounds like Without Remorse is going through the Paramount system, but it still doesn't seem to be much closer to happening from what I can tell. This would be Philip Noyce's last Jack Ryan film, though. He would actually go on to do The Saint, which I'll come to in a future Film Stories podcast, but there were still plans for Harrison Ford to do a third Jack Ryan film. The one that was earmarked was The Cardinal of the Kremlin, where apparently he would have co-starred with William Shatner in that film, but for a variety of reasons that project basically faded out, and eventually the Jack Ryan would return to the big screen in also the terrific The Sum of All Fears, starring Ben Affleck and directed by Phil Alden Robinson, made Field of Dreams. Amazing film. And I will come to The Sum of All Fears again in a future Film Stories podcast. But for Clear and Present Danger, I think I think when we talk about the finest films of Harrison Ford, there's a whole plethora of movies in there. Clearly, I mean, he's got such a body of work, but I really think this one is right up there. I think it's a terrific movie. I think it's tense. I think the score to it is amazing. I think even though there's really a paucity of action sequences in there, when they're in there, they really deliver. The irony is, really, that this was a film that started shooting with a looser script than Patriot Games, and yet the other side of it, I think it comes out as the better film. Either way, Patriot Games, Clear and Present Danger, I think is a really good double bill, and I do recommend them. Which brings me to the halfway point of this first Film Stories podcast of 2020. If you like this podcast, then please, it helps enormously if you can subscribe to it and leave ideally a very positive review. I am an independent publisher. I don't have riches. I don't have a big company behind me. I exist purely on your word of mouth and good wishes. And thank you so much for everyone who's supported me to this point. I can't tell you how much it's appreciated. I also produce Film Stories and Film Stories Junior print magazines. The Film Stories is monthly, 100 pages full of film mayhem. Also gives lots of opportunities to people as well. The Film Stories Junior is the world's only, to my knowledge, regular print film magazine for under 15s, primarily written by under 15s as well. You can order copies and find out more about both magazines over at the website www.filmstories.co.uk. Also, I should flag that you could get this podcast earlier if you backed me on Patreon. It's not compulsory. I'll always make this podcast available for free. I'm just trying to cover just a few of my costs. You can find me on Patreon at patreon.com/Simon Brew. That's enough plugs and waffle, though. I'm going to bring things back to, well, a film that came out far more recently than I usually talk about. I'm going back to 2018 and to a really terrific comedy. Here's a little snippet of the trailer. I'll come to the story the other side of this.
Over 500,000 children are currently in foster care. The county puts these on because they can match a lot of kids and parents quickly.
Look at the big kids.
Everybody's avoiding them. I'm gonna go and say hi.
But they're teenagers, okay? They use drugs and they watch people playing video games on YouTube. We're not equipped for any of that.
Hi! Just FYI, we can all hear you. It's okay. Go mingle with the kiddies and don't give it another thought. Bye-bye.
She was cool.
She really was as well. That's 2018's Instant Family, written by Sean Anders and John Morris, directed by Sean Anders. The cast for this one: Mark Wahlberg and Rose Byrne as Pete and Ellie. Is Isabella Mona, now known as Isabella Merced, in the role of Lizzie, Gustavo Escobar, Juliana Gamitz, Octavia Spencer, Tig Notaro, Julie Haggerty also in a brilliant cameo role. Likewise, Joan Cusack as well. I think this is a really funny and moving comedy drama, and I make no apology at all for banging the drum for it, because if you've not seen it, it just looks like on the surface like a throwaway Hollywood comedy, and there is so much more to it than that. But the story to this one started with its director and co-writer, Sean Anders. So if we dig back into the career of Sean Anders, with no disrespect to him, I wouldn't necessarily have seen this coming, that he started off along with John Morris, doing screenwriting work. He wrote She's Out of My League, Hot Tub Time Machine, Mr. Popper's Penguins, We're the Millers. He did the screenplay to Dumb and Dumber 2, to Horrible Bosses 2. But he also slowly moved into directing. He did direct Horrible Bosses 2. He made his directorial debut in 2005 with Never Been Thawed. Then he did Sex Drive. Then he did the Adam Sandler comedy That's My Boy. He struck box office pay dirt, though, with the Daddy's Home films, directed in 2015 and 2017. But back in 2012, he and his wife Beth started fostering children, and they became foster parents to 3 siblings. They went from having 0 kids to 3 kids pretty much overnight. A year later, they adopted them. And this was happening while Anders' film career was bubbling up. So they come to he and Morris have come to prominence for writing not necessarily hugely loved comedies, although I know Hot Tub Time Machine has an awful lot of fans, but successful commercial comedies, to the point where they were hired to write Daddy's Home, which was a project Mark Wahlberg was shepherding, and he would prove pivotal to the Instant Family project. That it was when he signed up to do Daddy's Home, he came into Mark Wahlberg's orbit, really. So going back to his experience with fostering, Anders started noodling ideas with Morris for a script based on the film of the experiences that he and his wife had gone through, and he started working on that around 2015. And he drew on conversations with his children. He would talk to lots of experts. He knew he had to get this right. This was a story of the fostering system really, in the US, the number of children without families, without parents, who are desperately looking for new homes. And he was having to tread a very tight line between getting the comedy beats of this right, but also not shortchanging the harsher edges of the system and some of the darkness of the story. So he talked to lots of people. One of those was someone called Mairead Green, and she'd been in the adoption system since she was 8. She was finally adopted at 13, and Anders met up with her and, as it turned out, would send her an early draft of the script, and she pretty quickly replied with notes that she wanted the stereotypes of fostering and adoption to be more keenly addressed, that there's a cliche that if you've been adopted or fostered that you're destined for a life of crime, and that was exactly the kind of thing she wanted to push against in the film. She needed it to be real, and in fact the idea of a birth mother who didn't want to care for you came from her as well, from some of her input and some of her ideas. And so whereas Anders and Morris in their draft of the script had pulled back on the idea of that they didn't want to present people as villains, parents who wouldn't or couldn't care for their kids as villains either, but in the film, again, not wishing to go particularly spoilery, this is presented in a relatively harsh way, and that came from the input of the experts and from Green, that Green, clearly an expert, that Anders and Morris were talking about. And as it would happen too, Green would be employed on the film when it finally went into production, and she would spend a lot of time with Isabella Merced in helping Merced get the role of Lizzie correct. Now, the role of Lizzie is a pivotal one in the film, and I think Merced's performance is exceptional. And whilst this is a fictionalized story that he put on the screen, it is very much based on Sean and Beth Anders' experience. Now, in real life, they didn't adopt a teenager, but they were going to, as it happened at one point, and they were actually turned down by a girl who they were planning to foster or adopt, who was holding out for her real mum to return, and that's one of the narratives that they weaved into the film. Anders wanted a teenager in there. He thought that the dynamic would be particularly interesting with a teenager in the film, and also very real. It would help get across some of the dramatic beats of the movie too, and that's where the character of Lizzie came from. And again, he interviewed lots of families with adopted teens in coming up with the character. He was determined that the film didn't sugarcoat this. In several interviews he gave around the release of the movie, he said what he was looking to get was to combine laughter and trauma, really. So he and Morris got the script together, but they were also working on Daddy's Home too. And by the autumn of 2017, with Daddy's Home 2 not far away from release, they were in a place to move forward with their screenplay. As it would turn out, Daddy's Home 2, which starred Mark Wahlberg again, would be a hit in the Christmas of 2017. And so by this point, Anders had made 2 films with Wahlberg, but he knew for the lead role, for one of the lead roles here in the movie, that what he needed was an actor who could combine the comedy and the drama, and he just felt that Wahlberg was the right person for this. Now, they'd written this script on spec. It's worth noting that. So if you're not familiar with spec script, it is as it sounds. You write one with the hope that someone will buy it, but no one's paying for the development of it. It's a flat out gamble on your part to put your effort and your hours in the hope that a studio or a film company will pick up the movie. And so they got into it not ruling out this being a low budget film, but that what Anders really wanted Instant Family to be was a big broad Hollywood comedy, because he felt that's the best way to get all this across, and also he wanted it to be a hugely enjoyable film too. And so what he did at this point, when they had the script in place, was he sent an email to Wahlberg, and again in interviews in the build up to the film's release, he admitted he spent a lot of time shaping that email. He didn't quite know how this was going to land. As it turned out, Wahlberg called Anders the following morning and instantly said yes to the film. He'd had some experience of seeing kids through the system, and he really wanted to put this on screen as well. And so with Wahlberg aboard and the Daddy's Home team reunited, Paramount was interested. Paramount had put out the 2 Daddy's Home movies, and it wanted this new film, and it pretty much said yes at that point. So then the rest of the film started to come together. So one of the key pieces of casting was Rose Byrne, and I think Rose Byrne is a tremendously gifted actor. She actually signed on the dotted line for this one in November 2017. So just to give some idea of where we are in the chronology of this, Daddy's Home 2 was about a month away from release at that point, when Instant Family was really starting to cast up in earnest. Now, at this point in her life, Byrne wasn't really looking for a movie. She just had her own child, and finding a film to shoot at this particular point in time was not high on her agenda. But she got sent the script, and she responded hugely positively to the script. She still had tonal concerns over it. Going back to that point, how do you balance the comedy and the drama and the darker elements of this? And it took a long phone call with Sean Anders to go through that, to express her concerns, and for him to answer those concerns. And she said in interviews in the build-up to the film's release that she found herself in a position where she trusted Sean Anders. He knew this world far better than her. He'd had the experiences that they hadn't, and so when it actually came time to shoot the movie, what they'd find is they would push the comedy, and then Anders would pull it back where it needed to be pulled back. The rest of the cast took a few more months to come together. So at the end of 2017, Rose Byrne and Mark Wahlberg were in place, but it wasn't until February that key supporting members of the ensemble were confirmed. Specifically, Octavia Spencer, Tig Notaro, and Isabella Merced were all announced as cast at that point, and each of them has pivotal roles in this movie. And by this stage, Paramount had very definitively given it a green light, and the idea was that Instant Family it was going to be a relatively quick shoot, that a March start date was earmarked for the film, with an idea of releasing it in early 2019. The film was going to cost around $45-50 million to make, and so it was by this stage pretty much full steam ahead. Now, the decision was made to shoot the movie in Atlanta. This was there's no getting away from this. Generous tax credits had their part to play here. It's why you're getting big Marvel films and such like also shooting in Atlanta. But also the fact that they were shooting this film in the spring. I mean, Los Angeles, for budget reasons, wasn't really top option, and in the spring they looked at Canada as a possible place to shoot the movie. But the weather in Canada around the spring, well, they suspected they were likely to get snow, and that wasn't really the look they were going for with the film. Hence, Atlanta, although they still set it within the California system, because that was again the world that Anders knew. He didn't know how things varied, what the nuances of the Atlanta system were. The last pieces, though, before they could start shooting of the casting jigsaw were the younger kids in the film, and for this, as you would expect, auditions were held. But one thing that Anders was keen to do here was not just audition kids in isolation. He wanted to see their parents alongside them, and his thinking there was what he needed was kids very much with their feet on the floor. He believed that good parents help give kids better performances, and he needed these performances to be very real and very down to earth, as well as very funny. And so that's how the audition process panned out, that the parents were involved in it as well. When it actually got time to filming the movie, one of the ways Anders could have gone here, because of the sensitivities of the subject matter, there was a temptation to perhaps follow the script to the letter. But that's not how Sean Anders as a director works, and he was relatively relaxed with improvising, perhaps to the surprise of one or two in the cast, that people were allowed just to try things and give things a go, and it would always be to him to kind of shepherd it back to where it needed to go. That even though that he and John Morris had put a script in place, that they'd worked their backsides off to get to a shooting script, there was room for deviation from it. And so the filming, it was completed relatively quickly in the spring of 2018. And so at this point, Paramount had announced a release date of February 2019. It didn't leave Anders a huge amount of time to get his edit together, but also this wasn't a technically complicated film, and it was as much a tonal and a comedic challenge as anything else. The openly admits to being really scared of the first test screening of the movie, though, because this was really his first taste of, had he got this right? I mean, this was, in a weird way, make or break for the movie. This first test screening would be the first litmus test for people who perhaps didn't have experience of the foster adoption system in the US and how they would react to a big studio comedy based in and around it. The test screening blew them away. The response to the movie was far in excess of what Paramount Pictures was expecting, and it was clear very, very quickly that it had something a bit special here, to the point where, off the back of the test screening reactions, and also a special screening was held at a conference of people who work in foster care and adoption, with adoptive families also in the audience, and the reaction at that also blew them away. The response that a big Hollywood film was addressing it with such care and such humour and such warmth and such edge, really, their world was really the resulting response was really something, and it gave Paramount an awful lot of confidence, to the point where it moved this comedy that was not on, really, with all due respect, on many people's radars, from February 2019 to a release in November 2018 in the US. We'd still have to wait till 2019 in the UK, but it was going slap bang into a blockbuster season, going up not far from Fantastic Beasts: The Crimes of Grindelwald, which was one of the biggest releases of that particular season. Now, there was plans afoot for a glitzy premiere that had to be shelved in the light of the wildfires that were spreading through Southern California at the time. And there was some nervousness leading up to the release date of the film, that it was finally released on November the 16th, 2018 in the US, and it found itself some room in it. Turned out to be a modest hit in America. That weekend, Fantastic Beasts opened to $62 million worth of business in the US. The Grinch was holding over in second place, Bohemian Rhapsody in third, but Instant Family opened with $14 million in the US, just ahead of Widows, which opened with $12 million. And the thing was that the test now was, would it hold its audience? Would word of mouth carry it through to a good return? And it only dropped 15% of its business in the second week. In the third week it dropped a little more, but nonetheless it was clear that even though this wasn't going to be a monster hit, this film was working. And by the time it had finished its US release, Instant Family had banked $67 million. It would add another $50 million overseas as well, for a very tidy and decent return of $120 million. But this one's not per se about the money. Even though Anders was looking for his film to go out to a broad audience, the response afterwards, I mean, if you sit through the credits of the film, it talks about what you can do, how you can get involved, how you can find out more about foster care and adoption. That the website for the movie was less focused on the movie, and that there was a determination, there was a tale to this film. And even to this day, if you load the website up, it talks about how you can get involved, what you can do, what you can learn. And it's almost one of the most unusual things, that the website for the movie is almost an afterthought to it. And I really think that that's something special, that this film, without wishing to sound too twee about it, and again, it could just be seen as a throwaway Mark Wahlberg comedy. It's absolutely not. But this film could and probably will change someone's life further down the line, and the filmmakers will never hear the story of that, but someone is going to watch this film and be inspired. I mean, I really think it's something special, and to get something like this through the Hollywood system, I think it's not a crude comedy, is it? It's not a sequel comedy. It's just a comedy with a massive beating heart and a massive slice of life at the heart of it. And I really think if you've not had the opportunity to do it, do check it out. And full credit to Sean Anders for taking films that I think have been relatively divisive to this point and using them as currency, and throwing so much of his life and throwing that currency into a project like this. My hat's off to all concerned. And that brings me to the end of this episode of Film Stories. So I am on Twitter if you want to hear more of my mumblings over there, at Simon Brew. You can find the entire Film Stories project on Twitter at Film Stories Pod. Over at YouTube, we have a whole host of exclusive YouTube film stories that we've been gradually building up. You can find that at youtube.com/film stories. We also hover around Facebook from time to time. You can find us there if you're so inclined at facebook.com/film stories online. As always, I can't thank you enough for your support and for taking your time to listen to this podcast. I wish you all nothing but the best, and really, let's all have a much better 2020. Wouldn't that be amazing? I'm now going to go away and start watching loads more films, because I've got loads more Film Stories podcasts to put together. And so with that in mind, I wish you all the very best. Thanks for your support. You all take care, and I'll be back soon with another bunch of Film Stories. Bye bye.